What if Thomas Edison, America's greatest inventor, the man of wires, light bulbs, and phonographs, once admitted the soul survives death? Not in a séance, not in a sermon, but in a private interview recorded in 1922 and buried for nearly a century. Recently unearthed from a forgotten archive, this conversation reveals something Edison never shared publicly: his secret experiments, and one confession about life after death that could change how we see everything. This isn't folklore. This is the part of Edison's story no one wanted you to hear. So, here's what almost nobody knows. In the fall of 1920, 2 years before this now unearthed interview, Thomas Edison began work on something he never spoke about publicly, at least not in full. He called it simply the device. Not a phonograph, not a light bulb, not even one of his early sound recorders. This machine had a far stranger purpose: to detect the presence of consciousness after death. And he wasn't joking. Unlike spiritualists who relied on mediums or parlors filled with rapping tables and candle smoke, Edison wanted a clean interface, a system based on measurement. His idea: that if the human mind really did survive bodily death, if even a trace of intelligence lingered, it would leave behind a signature, a measurable frequency, a disruption in the field. Static, maybe, but intentional static. He theorized that if consciousness is a form of energy, it doesn't just vanish. Energy, after all, can't be destroyed, only changed. So why wouldn't the departing soul, as he sometimes wrote in his notebooks, leave an echo? And here's where it gets stranger. In a set of private journals, now sealed away in the Edison archives in West Orange, New Jersey, he outlined his attempt to create what he called a sensitive recording system, capable of picking up these faint emissions. Not metaphysical guesses, but literal hardware. Conductive plates, vacuum tubes, tuned oscillators. He built a prototype in his lab with a small enclosed booth where a recently deceased body could be placed, connected to sensors and amplifiers. The early tests, according to those notes, were quiet. But then came something different. In one experiment, the sensors registered an anomaly, a pattern in the readings, not random noise, but a brief repetition, like a pulse. It lasted 7 seconds, long enough to stop the room. Edison, ever the rationalist, wrote that the signal was probably a coincidence, but he also wrote this: if intelligence survives, it must speak in the language of physics. Let that sink in. This wasn't some medium channeling spirits from beyond a veil. This was Edison, arguably the most grounded, material-minded inventor in history, designing a physical bridge for something science couldn't yet explain. He wasn't trying to prove the afterlife. He was trying to capture it. And yet, he stopped. We don't know exactly why. Maybe the results disturbed him. Maybe the lack of consistent readings frustrated him. Or maybe, just maybe, he saw something in that signal that he couldn't explain. A fragment, a whisper, a feedback loop from somewhere else. Some say he feared ridicule. Others suggest private funding was pulled. Still others hint the U.S. military took interest and classified what he found. Whatever the case, the machine was never completed. What we do know is that after 1922, the designs vanished. His assistants said nothing. The notebooks went into storage, some pages torn out, and this lost interview, found in the private collection of a defunct scientific journal editor, was never published. Until now. In it, Edison says something that should have been headline news a century ago: that consciousness, in his words, may be something far more organized than we currently understand, something capable of leaving fingerprints. Imagine how different history would be if this quote had made it into textbooks. But here's the thing. This isn't about proving ghosts exist. It's about something deeper. Edison's experiment wasn't about fear or comfort. It was about continuity, about whether the mind leaves a residue, whether your thoughts, your will, your choices leave a trace that matters. He tried to build a machine that could detect the final breath of consciousness, not just biologically, but metaphysically. And, for a brief moment, it might have worked. So now, ask yourself, not in a mystical sense, but in the way Edison might have asked, what if your awareness doesn't end with your heartbeat? What if your memories, your regrets, your intentions imprint themselves onto the world like heat on glass? What if one day a machine finally captures that echo and proves we were never just machines ourselves? He didn't talk about it often, not in public at least, but buried deep in a faded black notebook labeled simply "personal, not for publication," Edison recounted something even his scientific peers dismissed. He had been there, not just in the physical sense, but as a witness to something he couldn't fully explain, the exact moment of death. According to that hidden entry, Thomas Edison wasn't merely theorizing about the soul. He was trying to catch it in the act of leaving. In one account, he describes standing at the bedside of a longtime friend and lab assistant, a man whose name was omitted, possibly to protect privacy, or perhaps to avoid ridicule. The entry begins clinically. Edison noted the time of day, the humidity in the room, the electrical field readings from nearby instruments he had intentionally set up. But then the language shifts. Suddenly, the measured inventor writes something different. There was a pause, he notes. Not silence, but something beyond silence, as if the room inhaled. He had expected a medical moment. Heartbeat ceases, breath fades. But what caught his attention was not the physical body, but the atmosphere. It was like a vacuum had passed through, like a motor winding down but still releasing energy. Edison likened the experience to a final pulse of electricity shooting through a copper wire. Not the function, but the echo. It wasn't a poetic flourish. It was a hypothesis that consciousness, once freed, might briefly interact with the physical world, leaving behind a ripple, an electromagnetic trace. And this wasn't a one-time story. He would later document a similar sensation when his first wife passed. The emotional weight of that moment is mostly absent in the pages, replaced by data points, room temperature, oscillation shifts on an electromagnetic coil he placed near the bed. A pendulum slowed for exactly 3 seconds, despite no measurable change in wind or vibration. He didn't call it a soul, but he did say something passed. One entry reads, "If light is both particle and wave, might consciousness be both substance and signal?" These weren't metaphors. This was an inventor wrestling with invisible mechanics. According to notes left in the margins, Edison attempted to replicate the moment of death with simulated environments. He used sealed rooms, electrical fields, and animal testing. One entry describes placing sensitive photographic plates under pillows of terminal patients, hoping to capture some sort of energetic discharge. The results were inconclusive. Faint patterns, strange fogging, but never repeated under the same conditions. Still, Edison believed the lack of consistency didn't disprove the theory. It suggested individuality. "No two minds leave alike," he scribbled. "Perhaps they leave in frequencies we haven't yet named." There is one passage, never meant for the public, where Edison suggests something startling. He writes that during one of these observed deaths, he felt as though something was looking back before leaving. He doesn't elaborate. No flourish. Just that one line. For a man known for precision, it was perhaps the most emotionally charged sentence he ever wrote. There are rumors that this particular journal, the one with the more detailed experiments, was initially set for publication posthumously. But the family allegedly blocked its release, citing personal and philosophical speculations that could tarnish his scientific legacy. Some pages have been found, some confirmed by handwriting experts. Others are missing entirely, marked only by placeholder lines like page 17 intentionally removed. And that's where the mystery deepens, because a handwritten note found folded in the back cover of that notebook contains one final phrase. A phrase many believe was Edison's private conclusion after decades of quiet research. What leaves isn't gone. It just no longer needs a name. It's unclear what prompted this particular reflection. Some speculate it was written shortly after his own near-death experience in 1921, when Edison suffered a serious health crisis and briefly lost consciousness. Others believe it was an amalgamation of all the observations, all the failed measurements, all the quiet stares into nothing, where something always seemed to stare back. Today, most history books mention Edison's experiments with spirit communication only in passing, if at all. But these journal pages, if authentic, suggest he was far more serious than he let on. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was tracking continuity, not faith, not superstition. Just a single, unanswered question. What if energy, even the energy we call self, never really disappears? And more importantly, what if, in some strange way, it remembers? Thomas Edison's genius wasn't confined to inventing light bulbs or phonographs. He was deeply curious about the unseen forces that shape our existence. As radio technology emerged in the early 20th century, he became fascinated by how invisible waves could carry sounds across vast distances without any physical connection. This breakthrough sparked a radical idea in Edison's mind. Could consciousness itself be a form of energy, a signal vibrating at a frequency beyond what we can normally detect? Rather than imagining the soul as a fixed, intangible essence trapped inside the body, Edison began to view it more like a radio transmission, an electromagnetic pulse that carries information and life. Just as a radio can tune into certain wavelengths and lose others, the soul might shift frequencies during life, and particularly at death. This shift would move the soul's signal out of our normal sensory range, making it invisible but not vanished. Edison was not chasing mysticism. His approach was rooted in science and technology. He believed that if the soul emitted any kind of energy or imprint when it departed the body, it should be possible to capture or measure it with the right mechanical devices. Inspired by the technology of radio receivers, Edison began designing machines equipped with tuning circuits, crystals, and oscillators, components known to detect and stabilize signals. His notebooks, now locked away in private archives, reveal detailed sketches of these experimental apparatuses intended to pick up what he called intelligent energy beyond the grave. Despite many trials, Edison's machines never produced clear, indisputable evidence. The signals he detected were often irregular, sometimes just static, other times odd blips that might have been dismissed as electrical interference. Yet Edison remained convinced that these faint, elusive pulses were not random noise, but the residual vibrations of consciousness leaving the physical realm. This was a revolutionary leap in thought for his time. Mainstream science and society were not ready to entertain the idea that life might continue beyond death in any measurable way. The prevailing view was materialistic, grounded in biology and physiology, where death marked the absolute end of personal existence. But Edison's frequency hypothesis hinted at something far more expansive. That death was not silence, but a change in tune. This concept has quietly echoed through the years. Decades later, a small number of fringe physicists and parapsychologists began exploring similar ideas. That consciousness could exist independently of the brain, functioning as a form of energy interacting with fields or dimensions still hidden from scientific understanding. More recently, some quantum theorists have speculated about the potential for consciousness to be linked to fundamental quantum processes, suggesting that what we perceive as the soul might be connected to particles or forces we cannot yet fully grasp. The frequency hypothesis reframes the soul as a dynamic entity, not static and confined, but continuously evolving and moving through unseen states of existence. When the body dies, the soul's vibration shifts, detuning from the physical plane and slipping into realms beyond normal human perception. The soul doesn't simply vanish, it becomes imperceptible, like a radio broadcast that fades when you change the dial. Thinking about the soul this way radically changes how we approach life, death, and what lies beyond. It turns the final moment of death from an ending into a transition. Life becomes a continuous flow of energy, a broadcast that pauses for us but carries on elsewhere. Edison's vision challenges our common sense assumptions. What if your very essence is still out there, vibrating in a frequency no machine today can yet decode? What if memories, emotions, and consciousness leave behind traces, echoes that might someday be picked up, revealing a map of existence that stretches beyond our brief physical time? This shifts the conversation about life after death from religion and speculation into the realm of physics and engineering. It suggests that one day, with advanced technology, we might be able to listen in on these faint signals, turning what was once the domain of superstition into a field of scientific inquiry. At the same time, it asks us to reconsider what it means to be alive. If consciousness is a frequency, then existence is less about a fixed state and more about a process, a vibration that can move through different planes and forms. We become less like isolated individuals and more like travelers moving through a spectrum of being, always changing, always connected. There is also a humbling implication. Just as we can't hear every radio station, there are dimensions of reality we cannot yet access. Our senses and current instruments limit what we perceive. But this limitation does not mean these dimensions are not real. Edison's frequency hypothesis offers a hopeful possibility that our understanding of the soul and life itself is only just beginning. Edison's notes and designs remain hidden, overshadowed by his more famous inventions, but the ideas they contain are quietly powerful. They remind us that the boundary between science and spirituality may be thinner than we imagine, that what seems like mystery today might become the science of tomorrow. The frequency hypothesis is not just about death, it's about transformation. It invites us to think about ourselves not as fixed points, but as waves moving through space and time. It urges us to consider the possibility that death is a change in the tune of our existence, not a final silence. And so the question remains open. Are we ready to build the tools and open the minds needed to detect the soul's elusive frequency? Are we prepared to expand our understanding of life beyond the material and embrace a universe humming with unseen energy? Edison's journey was an invitation to listen carefully to the static, the blips, and the faint signals we have yet to interpret. The truth about consciousness, he believed, was waiting in the waves. Some pages of Edison's work vanished without explanation, sealed away by those closest to him, never to be seen again. Hidden in private collections and lost archives, these missing writings hint at secrets far beyond electricity and invention. They speak of a final design, a warning whispered in shadows, and a boundary Edison feared to cross. What truths did these vanished pages hold? Truths powerful enough to be erased from history, and what might still be lurking in the silence they left behind. After Edison's death in 1931, a number of his notebooks and journals were quietly sealed off by family members and trusted associates. These documents were never meant for public eyes, and their contents have since become the subject of speculation and intrigue. Among these was the private collection from which the resurfaced 1922 interview emerged. However, that interview itself makes veiled reference to another document even more elusive, a letter Edison addressed to a scientific spiritualist somewhere in Europe, which has never surfaced in any archive. This letter reportedly contained details of a final design for the machine Edison had worked on, along with a chilling warning. Edison cautioned that crossing too far into the realm of the soul, beyond what science could safely observe, risked disrupting natural cycles that humanity might not fully understand. There was also a cryptic note about attracting unwanted attention from what lies on the other side, suggesting Edison believed there were forces or entities beyond human perception that could be provoked by such experiments. Whispers of removed pages and blacked-out sections in Edison's West Orange laboratory records add to the mystery. Witnesses and historians have noted discrepancies between documented inventories and what was said to have been destroyed or hidden. A blueprint, thought to be the key to the machine's final iteration, vanished without explanation shortly after Edison's passing, fueling rumors that those closest to him deliberately erased evidence to keep these revelations secret. The nature of these missing documents raises unsettling questions about the limits Edison sought to explore, and the boundaries he might have feared crossing. Was the secrecy motivated purely by family concern for reputation, or was there something far more profound at stake? Could these lost writings offer a fuller understanding of Edison's quest to detect the soul's imprint, or even reveal insights into the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? Whatever the truth, these vanished pages cast a long shadow over Edison's legacy. They invite us to consider how close humanity might have come to bridging the gap between science and the spiritual, and why such a bridge might have been deliberately dismantled. The silence surrounding these missing pieces speaks volumes about what our society fears, what it refuses to confront, and the profound mysteries that remain hidden just beyond our reach. What if the very man we celebrate as the father of modern invention had a secret so unsettling it threatened everything he stood for? Imagine a truth so controversial it could shatter the foundation of science as we know it, and so it was quietly buried, erased from history. Let's uncover why Edison's most extraordinary experiments were hidden from the world, and what that silence tells us about the limits of knowledge and the power of control. The institutions that funded Edison's work, industrial magnates, banks, and scientific foundations, were invested not just financially, but ideologically in the triumph of reason. The blending of science with spiritual speculation was not only seen as a threat to Edison's legacy, but to the very foundations of American scientific identity. Skeptics and critics, wielding the growing power of mass media, began to paint his spirit phone experiments as folly, even lunacy. By the mid-1930s, the tone of public discourse shifted decisively. Newspaper articles stopped seriously referencing Edison's late-life pursuits into spirit communication. The concept was reduced to a punchline, a footnote in a long career otherwise celebrated for mechanical and electrical breakthroughs. Headlines mocked attempts to talk to the dead, and the narrative of Edison as a rigorous, rational inventor was reasserted, leaving little room for the spiritual side of his work. But beneath this public ridicule was a quiet, deliberate decision. Edison's more esoteric experiments were not just dismissed as eccentricities, they were deliberately excised from the story told about him. Families, foundations, and scientific bodies ensured that the notes, blueprints, and personal writings connected to these projects were sealed away or quietly disappeared. This act of omission was about more than protecting Edison's reputation. It was about controlling the narrative of what science could and could not explore. This suppression speaks to a broader cultural discomfort, a fear that acknowledging any intersection between science and spirituality might unravel the carefully maintained boundary between measurable fact and metaphysical mystery. Edison's spirit machine didn't just challenge the scientific method. It challenged the very notion that the soul, consciousness, or afterlife could be subjects of serious inquiry. What was at stake was not only Edison's legacy, but the collective identity of a society increasingly defined by technological progress and material certainty. Accepting Edison's spiritual experiments might have opened the door to questions that science was not prepared to answer. Questions about the nature of consciousness, the persistence of identity after death, and the possible continuity of existence beyond the physical world. This uneasy silence invites us to reconsider the cost of progress defined strictly by what can be measured and controlled. Edison's hidden work suggests there may be dimensions of reality that modern science has chosen to ignore, not because they lack evidence, but because they threaten to disrupt the tidy framework of empirical knowledge. Reflect on how history remembers its heroes, and what parts of their stories get left in the shadows. Edison's legacy, as widely known, is one of wires, bulbs, and motors. But behind the scenes, he was wrestling with questions that remain among the most profound in human experience. What is the soul? Does consciousness survive death? Can science extend its reach into the mysteries traditionally reserved for religion or philosophy? The decision to hide these pursuits was more than a historical footnote. It was a cultural act of denial, a choice to prioritize certainty over curiosity, conformity over revelation. In doing so, society lost an opportunity to bridge science and spirit in a meaningful way, and Edison's true quest remains buried beneath layers of skepticism and silence. This forgotten chapter of Edison's life challenges us to question who decides what knowledge is acceptable, and what is erased in the name of progress. What else might have been hidden, not just about Edison, but about the limits of science and the nature of existence itself? As we confront these questions, the legacy of Edison's suppressed experiments invites a reconsideration of what it means to seek truth. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is never simply about facts and formulas, but about the courage to explore the unknown, even when it threatens to change everything we think we know. If Thomas Edison, a man defined by reason, science, and the relentless pursuit of tangible progress, believed there might be a measurable soul, then everything we think about life after death deserves a second look. What if death is not a final cutoff, but more like a change in frequency? A light bulb might shatter, but the electric current powering it continues, invisible yet undeniable. We've been taught to think of consciousness as a product of the brain, something that flickers on with life and goes dark with death. But what if consciousness is not confined within our skulls? What if it's more like a radio signal, temporary and fragile when tuned to a particular receiver, yet still existing beyond that limited range? Edison's experiments hinted at this possibility. The soul as an energy pattern, a signal that can be detected, measured, and perhaps even communicated with. This isn't about blind faith or wishful thinking. It's about questioning the boundaries science has drawn, and being willing to explore what lies beyond. What if our current understanding of death and consciousness is only a chapter, not the final word? Imagine the implications, not just for science, but for how we live. If consciousness endures beyond physical death, what does that mean for how we treat our time here? If the soul is a form of energy passing through us, then our actions might ripple far beyond what we see. This is not a call to believe, but a call to reconsider. What if the great inventor's secret was a glimpse into a deeper reality, one that blends science, spirit, and the mysteries still waiting to be understood? The question is no longer, do you believe in life after death? But rather, are you open to the possibility that life is far more complex than we've been told? Maybe Edison never fully proved the soul's survival after death. Maybe his experiments never reached the clarity or precision he dreamed of. But perhaps he came closer than anyone before, or since, has dared to admit. What if the truth Edison glimpsed was so profound that it was safer to bury it beneath layers of secrecy and skepticism? What if the story of science, progress, and human knowledge has a missing chapter? One that challenges everything we thought we knew about consciousness, death, and what awaits us beyond. This lost legacy invites us to question the limits of our understanding, and consider that the boundary between this world and the next might be thinner, more permeable than we ever imagined. What remains locked away, waiting for discovery? The final answer, or just another beginning?